Perhaps one of the greatest inventions or advancements in photography at around the turn from the 19th to the 20th century was the switch from negatives being on glass to negatives being on film. In addition, they started to create things, film that could go into cameras like this, whereas those larger pictures I was talking about on glass were in cameras like this. So you can understand the portability and how this was almost like a reinvention of photography. If someone needed more detail, then you could get from something like a negative this size, there was 2 1/4, which is roughly 3 times larger, so you get that much more detail. You could go to 4 by 5, which gives you a lot more detail than this, or even 8 by 10 and 11/14. This happens to be a contact print made by Edward Weston from an 8 by 10 inch negative, which has got great clarity and detail, much more than you would get if you were to print this negative up to this size. Now, to talk a little bit about the enlarging process. So that was something that was invented much later, and you can think of it like if you're in the movie theater and the projector's way at the back and the screen's way at the front. Part of the reason that it's so far away is that you need that type of distance to make a 35 millimeter print go to the size of a movie screen. Same as when you're enlarging prints. Most people had the ability to make a 16 by 20 inch print from a 35 millimeter negative. You could do that in a darkroom by basically having your paper here and the enlarger up to about here shining down. You could increase that height to maybe to go by 2024. After that size, it got very difficult for most photographers to make anything larger than that. But I am going to use this example of a very large print by Larry Towell, who also took that picture, from the same series, The World from My Front Porch, to talk about burning and dodging, which is a process that you've probably heard of. And it relates to the exposure. So as before, we were talking how light acting on silver creates a reaction or a tarnishing, and that's really the secret of photography or the magic of it. In the case of the negative itself, when you see a light area of the print, because it's a negative or it's made from a negative, the darkest part of the negative creates the lightest part of a print. And conversely, the thinnest part of the negative will create the darkest part of a photograph. And it's the photographer's ability to control those gradations of tone to make a successful print. What you have to start with is what you call a base exposure. So what exposure am I going to make to create a photograph that looks as good on paper as it did in terms of what they pre-visualized? I'm going to take a guess that a print this size from 35 millimeter could have been a 2 or 3 minute exposure. Let's just say it was 2 minutes. What you do to find your base exposure is to make a series of test prints. So let's just pretend this is a piece of gelatin silver paper. You put that on an area that would go from light to dark to medium tones. And then you might go every 30 seconds to expose a little part of this test strip at 30-second intervals. So then you have maybe 6 or 7 different exposures on this piece of paper. This goes into a bath of developer, which is an alkaline solution that will accentuate the effect of the light on the silver. It basically grows the tarnishing. And then from there, after about 2 minutes, and you're agitating it to make sure you get a good wash of chemistry over it, then it goes into a stop bath, which is acid, and it stops the action of the developer. However, you still have silver salts that are sensitive, so it goes into a third bath called fixer, which was one of the major inventions in early photography. And then that stops the action of the light, so you have a fixed image. And then you have to wash it and what have you. But with a test strip, you would analyze and see what looks the best, and then you're constantly narrowing down. Like, let's say it was 2 minutes, looked fairly good. You might start at, a minute 45, and then every 5 seconds do another test strip. So you're constantly trying to find the perfect base exposure. From there, that's when the fun begins. You've probably heard about burning and dodging and wasn't really sure what that referred to. I'm going to see if I can show you what that's all about. So as we're talking about, the longer you give an area exposure, the darker it's going to get. Let's say you've made this print, and this white detail here, the seat of this trike, was probably very, very bright and probably very distracting and might keep your eye from enjoying all of the great details that are in this photograph. So what you would do is you would have to cover off the whole piece of paper that you're exposing, and then you make a little hole in it. And then by positioning the hole close to the area that you want to give more exposure, your source of light would then go through and only give more exposure to that little area. Similarly, when you're dodging, that's you're withholding light from a specific area to make it lighter than it would go normally during the base exposure. So I would say that probably this face of Anne's could have been a bit darker in a base exposure because of the light coming from behind, and you really want to see her face. So you have this tool that you move around during the base exposure to withhold light from this little tiny area. And you're not only doing that there, but you're doing it everywhere that you want to bring out more detail. So when you get to a print that's this size, in some cases it's more than one person can do in that short time frame. So it's very rare to find analog prints of this scale from 35 millimeter negatives.